On July 26, 2021, Judge Preska of the Chevron-funded Federalist Society found Stephen Donziger guilty of contempt after denying him and reading a newspaper during trial. No matter what they say, Stephen said, "My conviction today has everything to do with Chevron's destruction of the Amazon. They want to label me criminal so people forget the real criminals." He was right. This was after Stephen spent two plus years on 24/7 at-home surveillance and incarceration, and everybody colluded. Stephen's own New York state reps, you betcha, they're in on the climate destroying grift. Senator Gillibrand has received $200,000 in campaign donations from the law firm leading Chevron's attacks, and Jerry Nadler's own son is an associate there. So what did Stephen do? He did his job like a fucking boss, representing 30,000 plus Ecuadorian natives in a successful suit against Chevron for the environmental destruction and health effects caused by the megacorp's oil drilling. 2 years ago, 29 Nobel laureates joined together to publicly condemn the judicial harassment. Amnesty went light and called the actions of Chevron and friends against Stephen a misuse of the justice system. Greenspeak spoke of corporate intimidation. Simon Taylor, director of Global Witness, has warned that what's been done to Stephen has also been intended to intimidate the rest of us, including me, and to chill the work of other environmental and corporate accountability advocates. While Chevron's counteroffensive against Stephen endangered human rights and environmental work around the world, the mainstream media has largely ignored the legal attacks, as James North noted in The Nation, and Stephen himself points out all the time. Chrislyn Hedges has documented Chevron's intimidation tactics to pressure mainstream media outlets, including Fox News, GQ, and the New York Times, to not publish stories about Stephen's case. And that's why even still, even with my friend and 10 Demand supporter Susan Sarandon and I clamoring for years for justice, you still may not have heard of Stephen. But I knew of him long before. Some people worship God or gods, some worship celebrities. I worship brave, selfless justice warriors and thought leaders like Stephen Donziger. The first abolitionist book I ever read was the seminal Our Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, the Angela Davis. And in that iconic work, Angela quotes my guest today. Stephen said, "In the criminal justice field, the raw material is prisoners, and industry will do what is necessary to guarantee a steady supply. For the supply of prisoners to grow, criminal justice policies must ensure a sufficient number of incarcerated Americans, regardless of whether crime is rising or incarceration is necessary." If there'd been a mic, my guy would have dropped it. Today, I'm hoping we have time to discuss Stephen's work before, during, and after Chevron, our climate crisis and race to nuclear war, the persecution of journalists, movement lawyers, and whistleblowers, as well as his thoughts on the prison industrial complex, propaganda, and police and prison reform versus abolition. Welcome, Stephen. Apologies for the excessive intro.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. It's good to be with you today.
Thank you. It's an honor. You were just at a rally, as far as I know, for someone else who faces persecution. One of the most famous whistleblowers of today, Julian Assange. Let's start there. Were you able to attend the event? If so, what did you say to the audience? And what do you want to say to my audience? What would his extradition to the US mean? And how does his persecution, like yours, affect all of us?
Well, first of all, on the issue of Julian Assange, people need to understand the context in which this is happening. We are witnessing in my opinion, in the United States and in the larger global context, a competition between democracy and authoritarianism and also fascism. Okay, all of these elements are in play right now in a very, very aggressive way. And Donald Trump in the United States was a manifestation of this trend toward authoritarianism or even fascism. You're seeing this in France, you're seeing it in Sweden, and so many countries in Europe at the moment. So the attacks on Julian Assange, to me, are part of an increasing consolidation of what I would say corporate control, combined with the national security state, and like how to parse that out is getting increasingly difficult because they're often one and the same thing, to control the rest of us. And you're seeing this manifested in a variety of ways. An obvious way is through our court system in the United States, through the Supreme Court, that is a completely ultra-conservative reactionary court. That is 6 of the 9 justices, those that control the court. You're seeing it in the corporate prosecution by Chevron of me. That is, I got prosecuted for contempt of court after winning a big pollution judgment against Chevron as a lawyer, and the government refused to prosecute me, but Chevron ended up getting control to do it themselves. You're seeing it in how protesters are treated in the United States, that, you know, these incredibly draconian sentences, like for Jessica Resnicek, who's a peaceful, you know, person who committed a brave act of civil disobedience to save the planet. Was deemed a terrorist, put in prison for 8 years, didn't harm anybody. So you're seeing these attacks in an environment where there's a lot at stake and there's a lot at play. You know, legally, what's happening to Julian is outrageous. It's not right. I mean, you basically have, you know, a man who is a journalist and a publisher being attacked in retaliation for the fact he put out information that embarrassed the United States military. Exposed that it had been committing war crimes in Iraq, among other issues. So, you know, I can relate. You know, I got attacked by the same system, not to the same degree, but because I also challenged entrenched interests of power, you know, that were able to use the apparatus of the judicial system to try to get back at me, just like they're now trying to get back at Julian. So, you know, his extradition to the United States needs to be stopped. And frankly, these charges need to be dropped because he was engaged in what the New York Times does and has done during the Pentagon Papers, which was, you know, he was engaged in acts of journalism. And I'm sorry, you know, no matter how the US government or the Biden administration tries to frame it, that's really what it was. Nils Meltzer, by the way, there's been a lot of propaganda around Julian that's false. I just want to point out there's a great book about Julian by Nils Meltzer, Melzer. He's the former, he's a lawyer and former special rapporteur for the United Nations on torture, who's looked at Julian's case very closely. He's a very sober-minded journalist and an analyst, and he wrote a great book called The Trial of Julian Assange, which I recommend people read. It's really, really shocking the extent to which there's been this collusive effort to try to frame Julian for a crime that he really did not commit.
Yeah.
So we need to watch that case very closely. It's a bellwether case, and we need to protect him as much as we can.
And I consider yours the same. You know, there's so many different ways of oppressing or persecuting someone. I mean, sure, you didn't have to flee the country like Snowden, but I don't know if people really caught what you said. So we're going to repeat it now. And then I'd love for you to explain further. And then we can go back to the actual work, which is more important. But you said the government decided not to prosecute, but Chevron did it anyway. Please listen to what we're saying here. A corporation is somehow legally prosecuting a lawyer for doing his job, but let's say he didn't do his job. Does it even matter? This is a corporation. So Stephen, explain how that even can happen, and what you did that they think deserves this.
Okay, so first of all, what happened to me has never happened before in the history of this country. And I want to say at the outset, our criminal justice system has a lot of problems, as people know, police racism among them. You know, there's so much over incarceration, you know, the prison industrial company. We know about large problems. And those really matter. And I'm not saying mine matters more than those. So I want to get that on the table. But what happened to me has never happened before. It's a different animal. And it's this: I took on a corporation. I was successful in my lawyering and my human rights advocacy, and they wanted to make me suffer, punish me, and hold me up as an example So they abused the law, manipulated the system to have me locked up. And the way it happened is this: they convinced a judge, Chevron did, Chevron's lawyers, a judge who had investments in Chevron. It was a former tobacco industry defense lawyer. His name is Lou Kaplan, to hold me in contempt of court because I refused to comply with a court order that I turn over my computer and cell phone, that is all my confidential information, including the identities of my indigenous clients in Ecuador who have been harassed and threatened with death by Chevron or by some people. I didn't give that over to Chevron's lawyers. Now, this was a civil case in the United States that Chevron had filed against me after we won a $10 billion pollution judgment against them in Ecuador. You know, they were targeting me as punishment. And when I kept fighting and we kept making progress in other countries in the world to enforce the Ecuador judgment against Chevron's assets, they convinced this judge to issue this, what I think is an illegal order, you know, that I turn over my confidential information. It's attorney-client protected privilege information. I didn't flout the order. I appealed it to a higher court. Let me be clear. And I was very honest with the judge. I'm appealing this to a higher court, and he charged me, after I filed my appeal of his own order that I believed was illegal, he charged me with a criminal contempt of court for not complying with an order that I was appealing. On top of that, he had me locked up in my home with an ankle bracelet on the theory that I was a risk of flight, even though his charge was only a misdemeanor. Now, let me be clear, with the maximum 6-month sentence, and plus I was totally innocent, but let me be very clear. He took that charge to the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan. U.S. Attorney, for those who don't know, is appointed by the president, in this case, Donald Trump, to prosecute federal crime in a region of the country. There's about 100 of these U.S. attorneys' offices around the United States. Since this was a federal judge, he took it to the federal U.S. attorney, appointed by Donald Trump, who looked at the charge, looked at the facts, and refused to prosecute me. At that point, the judge did something to me that is patently illegal. He appointed a private corporate law firm to prosecute me instead of the government. The corporate law firm, Seward and Kissel, represented Chevron. So I was essentially prosecuted by a Chevron law firm, by Chevron itself. They controlled the law firm and the lawyer who did it, the private lawyer who did it. Rita Glaven was her name. And she asked for me to be locked up. So Chevron essentially deprived me of my liberty in the name of the US government after I was able to help indigenous peoples of Ecuador win a historic pollution judgment against the company. And for various reasons, I ended up locked up for 2 years and 2 months before I was able to even get a trial, at which point the judge, who also had financial ties to Chevron, denied me a jury. She was going to rule whether I was guilty or innocent. She refused to let me put on defenses. Read the newspaper during the trial, during witness testimony. All the main witnesses were Chevron lawyers against who I had been litigating. I mean, it was a joke. And everyone who was watching it, I sort of saw that. But they did it anyway. And at the end of it, she sentenced me to the maximum term of 6 months in prison on top of the 2 years and 2 months that I already spent with an ankle bracelet locked up in my small New York apartment, where I am right now, by the way, for over 2 years. So just to sum up, I was prosecuted by a corporation in the United States of America. I am the first target of a corporate criminal prosecution in the United States of America. What in my mind was a corporate political prisoner in the United States of America. We can't let this happen again. You know, one reason I'm talking to you and I do a lot of interviews is I am at a point where if like people don't understand how dangerous this is, they are going to get away with it. They want to make this the new normal. When I say they, I mean the fossil fuel industry, the oil industry, the pipeline industry, because they are the ones who continue to make enormous profits from an industry that's destroying the planet. And like, they're really bothered by lawyers like me and protesters like Jessica Resnicek and so many others. And they're trying to come after us to create a chilling effect. So no one protests, no one takes them on, and no one does the frontline earth defending, the water protecting that is so absolutely critical to save our planet.
Yes. And that's exactly, what the other activist was doing, and only that. And it's good that you tied the two together, because it's a multi-pronged approach that these corporations, and it sounds like particularly so far, these oil companies that are destructive in their very existence, and then they're being more destructive on top of it. There's also a lot of similarities to the Assange case, because the reason they're mad at him is for exposing secrets. And the reason you were held into contempt is because you didn't want to share your secrets. The difference is that your secrets are protecting indigenous people who've already been threatened. Assange is sharing secrets from a government trying to protect themselves from all the horrible things they're doing to us and people all over the world. One other thing I'll point out is just the amount of effort, the amount of money, time, resources that went into incarcerating a lawyer, who didn't break a law. This man he's well known. He looks like me, successful. When you are poor, Black, Indigenous, they don't even need to make such an effort, because the system is entirely rigged against the vast majority of our population. And they just get cycled in and out, which is a whole separate issue that was worth mentioning, because it was your preface. It is all one big corporate government effort, right? That's what the prison industrial complex is corporations profiting off of incarceration, like the oil companies profiting off of the destruction of our earth. So tell me a little bit more about what Chevron was doing, what the impact on Ecuador, an incredible country I had the privilege of visiting, what the impact was, and what the court decision, if it's followed, of course, would do.
Well, what Chevron did in Ecuador is none other than an apocalyptic disaster. But it's actually even worse, because it wasn't an accident like most oil spills you see around the world. They actually designed and engineered a system of oil extraction in the most pristine ecosystem on the planet, the Amazon rainforest, that had as part of its operational mechanism the deliberate dumping of billions of gallons of cancer-causing toxic oil waste into waterways, into rivers and streams that the indigenous peoples in the region, as well as farmer communities who live there, relied on for their drinking water, for their bathing, and for their fishing. They essentially engage in a mass industrial poisoning of the Amazon rainforest so they could save a little bit of money on their production costs. In other words, they sacrifice 5 indigenous peoples, their health, their culture, their environment, as well as those of dozens of farmer communities, so they could take their already high profits to even higher levels, I would argue even obscene levels of profit, billions of dollars of profit. Texaco made. It was Texaco, by the way, that did this. Chevron bought Texaco in 2001 and now defends all this. But they made an incredible amount of money while leaving behind what's probably the world's worst oil disaster, oil pollution, that continues to this day, over 50 years after they arrived, to kill people. It's that simple. And if you dump oil waste into the drinking water, whether it's Manhattan or Charlotte, North Carolina, Phoenix, Boise, Idaho, Chicago, I'm just throwing out cities, okay, or the Amazon rainforest, you are going to kill people. It's that simple. You can't ingest oil on a consistent basis without getting cancer. It's going to happen at some point, depending on a variety of factors. And thousands of people have gotten cancer. There's virtually no place to get treatment. Most of the people who have it have no money to even pay for a bus ticket to get to the cancer hospital in the capital of Quito, in Ecuador. And it's just a monumental public health catastrophe. No one knows the precise number, but I would personally estimate that thousands of people have died of cancer because of what Chevron did. Thousands, and many, many more will die in the coming years if this is not cleaned up immediately.
And those are murders, if you ask me. I love when people say police involved shooting, or they were killed in the process. No, that's a murder, and this is a murder because they knew what they were doing. And this has been happening for a long time. This is like an extravagant, horrifying example that is, and by the way, is not just going to affect the people there, but we all breathe the same air from the trees that are there. It's one earth, right? But this has been happening forever with the government, our government knowingly, just turning a blind eye. There was this situation maybe decades ago now, where one of the car companies just were like, oh, we're selling lemons, so actually let's just send them to Mexico instead. And that's what they did. And tons of people died in car crashes they knew were going to happen. They just would rather Mexicans die than US people. But again, what the people of Ecuador have experienced is a very long-lasting, widely impacting, horrible thing that you tried to stop, and this is what happened. And as far as I can tell, a big reason is, we talk about collusion, but just to be clear, the same corporations that are doing this are also donating to the politicians who are creating the laws, who are electing the judges and the prosecutors. And oftentimes it's the same ones that are donating to the police foundations that protect them.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, with regard to the Amazon, I mean, I've lived in New York City for 25 years. I've been down there over 250 times to work on this matter, try to help people. I've learned a lot. One of the things I've learned is the importance of the Amazon rainforest to the survival of the planet, to the health of the planet, to regulations of weather and, carbon and oxygen and, heat and cooling and rain. And, if you destroy the Amazon, and by the way, the Amazon is under threat from so many places, not just Chevron. There's fires in Brazil, that logging, ranching, oil. We're going to really, really hurt all of life's ecosystems, all of humanity around the globe. So, the people who live there, that is, some of whom are my clients, are they're the frontline defenders of all of us. Sorry. You can do what you can, and you should do what you can wherever you live to try to decrease your carbon footprint. But the real frontline defenders are living where the extraction is taking place, on lands and near waterways in the Amazon, and frankly, all over the world, including in North America and Canada, the United States. The 400 million indigenous peoples in the world are the frontline earth defenders and water protectors for all of us, and we need to support them. And, one thing I learned, I went down as a lawyer, oh, we're going to do this case and win this case and make Chevron pay you for the poisoning of your lands and of your bodies. And I realized that it's actually much bigger than that. I mean, yes, it's that, and that is the most important part of this case. But we are also lending support to these frontline defenders so they can fulfill their role on this planet and protect nature. So if you let the Chevrons of the world go anywhere, much less in this pristine ecosystem, and just undermine culture and undermine the defenders and undermine their ecosystems, the destruction of the planet will be accelerated and we will all suffer as is happening. So
Yeah.
the case is intimately connected to the larger issue of the survival of our planet, and also the larger issue of our democracy, the survival of our democracy. Because if we as lawyers and as advocates and as campaigners can't do this work without getting thrown in jail, we stand no chance. So the preservation or restoration of US democracy is related to the survival of the planet. And our case against Chevron is intimately connected to both of those issues.
Absolutely. And what about fracking here? I wrote a song about fracking a few years ago. And I felt like at the time, no one had even heard of it yet. It ended up getting passed around all over the place because there were a lot of anti-fracking groups, coming up who felt the same way. Like a year or two ago, like the Democratic darling that is Gavin Newsom approved like 25 new fracking permits in California. Any comment on what we're doing domestically too?
Well, if I were president of the United States, the first thing I would do is create a commission to come up with a plan to phase out the fossil fuel industry. Okay. We have to figure out a way to get rid of fossil fuels or we will not make it. Like, who doesn't get that? But, that's connected to the attacks on me, because the industry is so petrified, because they know any rational person would probably agree with me on this point, that we need to come up with a rational plan to phase out the industry, that they are attacking and trying to prevent that from happening. So that's one thing that needs to be done. Another thing is obvious, is like the oil industry right now is making windfall profits because of the high price of oil, because of the war in Ukraine, and for various other reasons. Why don't we have a windfall profits tax on the oil industry? The industry that, by the way, we as the public subsidize. We clean up their pollution all the time. They're fundamentally a grifting industry. They act like, oh, we're so important, we're so vital, we've earned all this money. No, you're a subsidized industry, and the massive profits you make go back, or a good portion of them, to lobbying and controlling our systems of government, so you can continue making your massive profits, and you can continue to destroy the earth. That has to stop. So we need a windfall profits tax. We need a plan to phase out the industry and transition in a much faster pace to clean energy. That's what has to happen. Now, it's obvious, right? Why doesn't it happen? I mean, why doesn't it happen? Well,
it's shocking to me because, like you said, like laughing, who doesn't get it? Right? Like if you're the product of generations of disinformation. So you hate Black people and Jewish people. Okay, I get that. It's going to take a long time to transform your understanding. But do you understand that if the oil situation doesn't change, the climate effects don't reverse, you and your family will also die? Like, it also impacts you, right? Like, to me, it should be the most obvious thing. It was also my mom's focus. And it was almost like I said to myself, the opposite of what you said. We're fucked, and I'm going to focus on the well-being of the most directly and heavily impacted people where I am, because that's all I feel like I can impact. I don't know. I didn't have that thought consciously, but it was almost like this is what I need to do. And, I'm sure you would agree, we all have things we should do. It's really important people recognize, though, if the environment is not their thing, perhaps because, I'll say it, they don't have the privilege to focus on it, it will eventually affect all of us. There will be no place to live for anybody if this isn't changed. And before I let you comment, I just want to say that a ticket of Donziger and Cornell West, if it hasn't already been suggested, would not be so bad. Any interest?
I love Cornell West so much about what he's written, his philosophy, his advocacy.
Would you ever run?
Look, my life is dedicated for making the world a better place. And if there was an opportunity to run, as it's understood in America, for something where I felt that would be a good use of my time, of course I would be open to it. Absolutely.
Good use of your time. That's important.
Well, I
And
have limited time. I want to do what I can,
right. And so the question would be, because we know we live in a really tightly controlled conspiratorial nation, that the service you would provide would be having an even bigger platform to share the stuff that you're sharing with me today, and hopefully change some minds, wake some people up. A huge reason we're in this place is how bad our education is, and how tied into religion and corporate interests our education is.
Well, I mean, our higher education system has become almost completely privatized for profit.
Yep.
And it's really hard to get access to it if you don't have resources. It's becoming a closed loop, right? I mean, you think education is where you open minds for critical thinking to change the world, make it a better place. And that is another system in our society that's becoming closed off, and believe me, those who benefit from the status quo don't mind the fact that people are not learning critical thinking skills. They actually don't want people to think critically. So the fact people can't get access to education, at an affordable rate, or once they get there, they, have people like former Ben Sass, the senator from Nebraska, is now the president of the University of Florida. Why'd that happen? The man has no background in education, and he voted for, every one of Trump's Supreme Court nominees. So even on the higher ed level, you're seeing this right-wing takeover or attempt to take over some of our institutions, like the University of Florida, which is a pet peeve of mine because I was born and raised in Florida. Just that's why I'm kind of focused on that.
Yeah.
But there's so many areas in which this is all playing out that you really have to, it's almost dizzying to keep up with it all. But the fundamental issue in my mind is this, what I said at the beginning of this show, which is the competition between democracy and authoritarianism, or even fascism. All of these elements are in play right now in the world and in the United States. We cannot take for granted that we're going to have our liberal democracy, as flawed as it is, forever. We cannot, take for granted that the rule of law, as flawed as it is in the United States, will continue to exist, because even that is a real irritant to those who want to consolidate power in our world so they can make even bigger profits and keep tax rates low for the very, very rich. So all this is playing out right now, day to day, and you see it manifested in, for example, the midterms. Some of these election deniers are now on the ballot in many states. There's so many things happening that are of concern. It requires really significant engagement, I think, by all of our population. And it requires really developing the critical thinking skills so you can understand what's happening, that you cannot get all your information from the corporate dominated mainstream media and just say, oh, I'm informed. No, you have to look at that critically, so that's why, by the way, I love, going on shows or podcasts like this one. I mean, it's very important we take the time to reach audiences with perspectives that you will not see on television, or at least on the corporate controlled parts of television, which is almost the entire thing. So I'm really happy to be on your show, and I'm happy that you do what you do.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is like a bucket list thing for me. So, and it's important to me to have, listen, you also understand the abolitionist stuff that I do, but even if you didn't, having someone like you on is so important too, for, context and broader understanding for my audience, because there are all of this is inextricably tied. Like I've said, about the corporations, donating to lobbyists for both police and for the oil companies. The same system that ignores virtually all corporate crime and is the same one that attacked you because you went against corporations, and the same one that incarcerates more people today, predominantly Black, Indigenous, brown people, than during the height of slavery or apartheid in South Africa. It also relates to the war we're in, right? And to the elections you've talked about. So I'd love to just quickly touch on Democrats versus Republicans, that whole thing. It seems like every Democrat has a Ukraine flag. And as my friend Kevin Gostola was saying to me recently on my show, it became a right-wing talking point very quickly to even question what this war could do, why it's being fought, et cetera, et cetera. So someone like you or me, like, we're not allowed to say that. I mean, I am anyway. I'm questioning it. As Kevin put it, like, what you're questioning is whether or not you want to end up in a nuclear war that destroys everything. And if that's true, which it seems like what's so hard about understanding that for the Democrats? How can they how can they talk so badly about the J6 insurrectionists who are Nazis, but not about the Azov battalion in Ukraine that are also Nazis?
Well, I think it's important that, historically people get that there's only 3 countries in the history of the world that had apartheid laws on their books. Okay. A lot of countries do a lot of bad things, but only 3 actually passed a series of laws that were racist on their face. Okay. And those countries are South Africa, Germany during the Nazi era, and the United States for a good portion of its history. And by the way, some of the US laws are still on the books, from various states around the country. Laws, preventing interracial marriage are still on the books, even though they're not enforced in many states. So that's our history. So, let's stop with the mythologizing of the United States of America, okay? And I'm not, listen, there's a lot of good things that happen in this country. There's a lot of wealth generated in this country. There's a lot of incredible people that have done incredible things to make life better for many, many people in this country. Okay. And there are freedoms in this country that you cannot enjoy in many other countries. Like, I get that. But let's stop the mythologizing, because we do have these serious, serious problems, mostly related to increasing corporate control, in my view, of our government. Okay. I'm talking about, when I say government, I'm talking about all 3 branches of our federal government and many aspects of state governments, meaning the judiciary is now dominated by judges who come out of the Federalist Society pipeline, which is pro-corporate, anti-regulatory, anti-women, anti-people of color, anti-indigenous, anti-tribal sovereignty. That's a whole philosophy. And because of various reasons, most related to the fact that George Bush, the young one, who did not win his election, appointed a slew of federal judges, as did Donald Trump, also did not win his election, appointed many, many more. Extreme young right-wing judges, often with very little experience in courtrooms, and they're now populating the federal bench. So, that allowed Chevron, I mean, this multi-year process allowed Chevron in the year 2019 to take over my prosecution. That would not have happened had there not been a multi-decade strategy really by corporate America, particularly the fossil fuel industry, to control our judicial branch, our unelected judicial branch, which is now manifesting in the worst possible way. Because in my view, as I wrote about this in The Guardian a few days ago, we have essentially had a judicial coup in this country without a shot being fired. You know, we have 6 justices on our Supreme Court who, for the most part, are making decisions that are going to determine how the rest of us 320 million people can live. That's what's going on. 6 are determining how 320 million can live. And, you know, and then the lobbying of Congress. I mean, the Republican Party is basically an arm of the fossil fuel industry. And the Democratic Party, respectfully, has been neutralized by the fossil fuel industry. It's not an arm. It's not as bad. And they make some noises about the climate issues. But like when push comes to shove, they do very little. I mean, Chuck Schumer is one of the biggest recipients of fossil fuel money of anyone in the US Congress.
Yeah, that's my state. Big.
And as you pointed out, I mean, my 2 senators in New York is Schumer and Gillibrand. They both take significant money from fossil fuel. Gillibrand takes money from the same Chevron law firm that prosecuted me and tried to destroy my life. So, you know, our government, you know, the executive branch, obviously, too. I mean, you know, Joe Biden he's trying to do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but like nothing fundamental. There's no plan to phase out the fossil fuel industry.
Right.
Because the fossil fuel industry controls the legislative branch, you know, and both parties are beholden to it. One is basically an arm of it, and the other is to a great degree beholden to it. So the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch have been all fallen under the control to some degree or another of this industry. Now, not all is lost. They don't control every element of it. They don't control every piece of it. You know, there are progressives who get elected, but you know, they don't want that to happen anymore. So they're changing the structure of elections and of our liberal democracy in ways that really are moving it toward authoritarianism at a very rapid pace. And by the way, it's not a big leap from authoritarianism to fascism, is it? You know, when you have, you know, a theory now that is before the US Supreme Court that a state legislature can actually determine who the slate of electors are to the Electoral College, regardless of the popular vote in that state, you are at a place where you no longer have democracy. You know, so again, we're in a very serious situation. And by the way, you know, I know you're into the prison issue. You know, I edited a book called The Real War on Crime in 1996, where I really wrote deeply about the prison industrial complex. I actually think it was the first book that really figured out.
I can't believe I haven't read this. So thank you for.
I'll give you a copy, but you know, the crazy thing is, at that time in the 90s, you know, Bill Clinton was all anti-crime, anti-black. He was exploiting this issue to get white votes, white independent votes.
Alongside Joe Biden.
Yeah. Ted Kennedy. I mean, you know, sorry, but like all these people were doing it. And people were like, well, why do we have so many people being locked up if crime rates really aren't going up? And we kind of tried to understand that. And you know, one of the reasons back then, this is in the 1990s, was the fact that there were elements in our society, including the private prison industry, but also the state prison bureaucracy, the unions, the prison correctional officer unions, that were making money from an increase in the prison population, which goes back to that quote that you cited at the beginning by Angela Davis, where she was citing me. Prisons, you know, bodies are the raw material for the prison industry. So you need to, you know, bring bodies into the system. And I saw this personally when I ended up in prison. Some of the people in there should not have been there, or those that should have been were in there for way too long. I mean, 20-year sentences for nonviolent offenses. And when I got out and I got put back on home detention to serve out the rest of my sentence in this apartment with an ankle bracelet, there was a private company called the Geo Group that was calling me 15 times a day. Are you home? Are you home? You know, and I had an ankle bracelet. By the way, in New York, because I'm in an apartment the GPS has a hard time picking up, tracking the bracelet. So they were like, "Oh, are you home? Are you home?" And they knew their equipment was totally flawed, because all I did was just say, "Yeah, I'm home," and say, "Okay, sorry to bother you." Click.
Jesus.
Half hour later, I'm just at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. And this was a
And
company.
you paid for it.
Well, I'm saying this was a company that was getting paid by taxpayers
Right.
to monitor. I don't know how many, but it was many, many people, probably over 1 million people around the country were on ankle bracelets being monitored by a call center in Indiana. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And who knows how many people they had hired working at this ginormous call center, calling people all day and night on ankle bracelets. And the company was probably charging the government $100 a day per person, $50 a day to do this. I mean, it's very lucrative business. And I just noticed, sorry, I'm going on and on. It's such a pet peeve of mine. Thank you for your work on this issue. But President Biden just made a major move on marijuana laws the other day, okay? To basically release everyone in federal prison on marijuana possession. Now, that was more symbolic than anything, because there's hardly anyone left in federal prison on marijuana possession, but still a good move. I salute the man. Good job. Okay. What's the reaction been? The private prison industry has spent massive sums of money to lobby states so they don't do the same thing. Because most people in prison on marijuana possession are in prison on state crimes. And they're lobbying to make sure that the change President Biden made at the federal level does not happen at the state level, so the raw material can still come into the system so they can continue to make money.
Pretty incredible. Particularly just, I don't know. I mean, I'm glad you called it what it was. It was mainly performative, similar to his declaration earlier on to get rid of private federal prisons. That's like 2% of all prisons. He's doing exactly what we abolitionists understand to be the very actions that strengthen the system. When you say that people in federal prison for marijuana possession should be released, you're saying that that everyone there for any other marijuana charge should not be released, that those in state prisons should not be released. When you talk about private federal prisons, you're ignoring the non-private federal prisons. You're also ignoring the fact that if you close down all the private prisons, even the state level, those people aren't getting released. They're just going to a government-controlled prison that also makes a ton of money for corporations through price gouging on phone calls, through the commissary, and through everything else. It's truly remarkable. And it just, because of this realization that like critical resistance had 20 or so plus years ago, that all of the work has not chipped away at the system. If we also think about war and environment, thinking about Chuck Schumer or about Gavin Newsom, like, what do we do? The rarity of someone like Kristen Jordan Richardson, an abolitionist, being elected to, our city council, that's rare as hell. So, and then you look at the squad, and the squad has done nothing other than tweet since joining. So the question I have for you, and maybe we can, close with this if you're up for it, how do we elect, like, how important is electoralism? I believe it's very important at the local level. I'm not sure it has any relevance beyond that, but you're talking a lot about the Republican arm being notably worse. What do we do about electoralism versus creating our own systems, which is like what I'm working on: mutual aid, community defense, transformative justice, peacekeepers and social workers doing wellness checks. what are your thoughts on electoralism today at the various levels? What do you advise voters do when faced with like a lose-lose?
Well, I don't see it as a lose-lose. I mean, I think it all matters. You know, I think when you want to make the world a better place, you want to engage in activism, the electoral piece matters greatly, as do non-electoral pieces. You know, I think you can't sort of put all your marbles in one little place and expect change to happen. It's sort of like being a lawyer. Like you can't become a lawyer and then just do law thinking you're going to make a big difference. Okay. But what you can do is do, you know, advocacy across multiple platforms, one of which is law, and make a huge difference, as I think we've done, for example, in the Ecuador case. So you got to be open to sort of working in the spaces that are available to you to make the difference you can make. And then, of course, what you choose to do with your time is a very personal choice. Like if you want to run for office, and I think people should run for office, people with progressive philosophy should get out there and run for local office and run for, you know, state office and run for even national positions like Congress, which, by the way, is such a rigged system in and of itself. It's like impossible to oust an incumbent. I mean, you know, people talk about countries like Cuba and, you know, Russia, where you have like a 98% reelection rate. I mean, we're actually the same in this country, you know, so countries, you know, the political systems tend to reflect the power structure that exists, right? And what we need to do in this country, in the United States, is do the hard work, the grassroots organizing, to call it out, you know, to make it better. And there's so many examples, by the way, of heroic, courageous people in this country taking on entrenched interests of power. I meet them all the time. It's crazy. Since I got detained and I got a lot of attention, people are contacting me and with their stories. And it's just extraordinary the number of courageous people there are out there fighting, which, by the way, is why this crazy, powerful fossil fuel industry, like, is so trivial that they actually would take the time to go after a Jessica Resnicek or, you know, and lock her up for 8 years when she didn't harm anybody and she interfered with the operation of a pipeline that was destroying the planet, you know. So we need to do what we can with what we have and the spaces available, and what you do is your choice. But, you know, my advice is try to do it in groups, do it in a way that you can create solidarity. Don't do it alone. It's scary. You're vulnerable. We gotta build movements and build coalitions of groups and people as we go about doing the work, whether it's criminal justice, climate, it's all connected, democracy, it's all connected. It's all part of the same picture, in my view.
Yeah, very well said. Sorry to interrupt there. Yeah, thank you. I you know, I value your opinion, needless to say. And so, you know, I kind of fall in the same place. A lot of people that I interact with said, you know, you can't vote for Democrats because they're weak and they just buckle and do exactly what the Republicans want them to do. But the alternative is essentially either literally voting for someone that totally disagrees with your ethics and priorities, or by not voting, you kind of vote for them too. So I don't think we really disagree there. There's no reason not to hit the system at every place that we can. Yeah, I do wonder. I just think that at the federal level, it's and even at the state level, it's really difficult to make changes that I'm looking to make. You know, I just think like the 10 demands that we created in 2020 create a roadmap toward abolition. They were kind of designed for someone in a community to bring to their city council. But you know, if your city council consists of all people you didn't vote for who disagree with you, you have no shot at passing the 10 demands. And the 10 demands include things for state and national level too. So, you know, we obviously understand the importance of electing the right people. It just might be a matter of what you said, getting more of those right people out there doing it.
Well, I'll say this, how you choose to take your limited energy, or how one chooses to take his or her limited energy and try to effectuate change, again, depends so much on the circumstances available to you and your choices and what you want to do. Do you want to work on a campaign to get a progressive candidate elected to Congress, or could that energy be better served by organizing something outside of the electoral system? Those are all questions that you can't answer in kind of a broad sense, but I think it would be unwise to dismiss any option, including trying to get into the House of Representatives at the national level, because there are things that need to be done there. Even if we can't get the laws passed in the short term, just being a voice of conscience, that the squad, by the way, often is. I mean, that is an important role they play. They go well beyond, but they do that really well.
Yes.
And we need that, because I mean, think if we didn't even have that.
Yeah, you're right. And they have the huge platform to make people think about alternative ways of viewing things. I agree. And I think it's important that I asked you this because of your answer. And I want people who are totally against electoralism to just consider what you've said, because your voice is just a bit more valuable than me ranting on here.
Well, I don't know about that, but let me just say, because I've been hit with a lot of shit. Okay. It's important, if you can avoid it, not to fall into cynicism. Okay. It's easy to be cynical about our situation because it doesn't look great. And like, what are the avenues of change? It seems to get worse, not better, even with a Democrat as president. So we cannot descend into cynicism. We must constantly do what we can. It's our role at this point in history. Okay. We are the ancestors to people to come. They're going to look at what we did. We can't be cynical. We have to do what we can, even if you can't really see the light at the end of the tunnel right now, today. But you start drilling through that tunnel. And often, this is a cliche, but the night is always darkest in the hour before the dawn. Think about that. We might be closer than we think, is my point. Keep fighting.
Thank you. Perfect way to conclude. I wish I could just keep you on and talk to you forever. Maybe I'll finally make it to one of the events so I can actually hang out with you and Susan.
I'd love to meet you in person. Let's definitely stay in touch. And thank you so much for giving me the platform. I really am honored.
It is my honor. Thank you so much, Stephen. And I will take you up on that. Prepared to be annoyed.
Thanks a lot.
All right, man. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.